is a particular kind of prison that has no bars. No walls, no locks, no guards standing at the door. It is built instead out of other people's expectations, out of the rules you inherited before you were old enough to question them, out of the voice, so familiar by now it sounds like your own, that says, "This is how things are done. This is what is proper. This is your place. Stay in it." Most of us live inside this prison without ever recognizing it as one. We dress the way we are supposed to dress. We speak the way we are supposed to speak. We pursue the careers, the relationships, the lifestyles that the world around us has quietly prescribed, not because we chose them freely, but because the alternative felt too dangerous, too exposed, too much like standing alone in an open field. We make ourselves smaller to fit into spaces that were designed by someone else. We add more decoration, more complexity, more noise, hoping that somewhere inside all of it, we will finally feel like enough. And we carry weight, not just physical weight, but the weight of trying to be someone we were told to be rather than someone we actually are. This exhaustion is not weakness. It is the entirely predictable result of living in opposition to yourself. But here is what history whispers to us, through the lives of those rare individuals who refuse the cage entirely. True freedom is not found by adding more. It is found by having the courage to take things away. And no life in the entire recorded story of human creativity makes this case more fiercely, more beautifully, more permanently than the life of Gabrielle Benhur Chanel. The woman the world would come to know simply as Coco. She was born in 1883 in Saumur, France, and from the very beginning, the world offered her almost nothing. Her mother was a laundrywoman, perpetually exhausted, perpetually ill. Her father was a traveling market vendor who was charming in the way that unreliable men so often are, present enough to create hope, absent enough to destroy it. Gabrielle was the second of 6 children, growing up in poverty that was not poetic or picturesque but simply hard, dirty, relentless. When Gabrielle was 11 years old, her mother died of bronchitis, worn down by cold, by work, by a life that had given her very little shelter. Her father, faced with the inconvenience of 5 surviving children, made a decision. He dropped the girls off at an orphanage and left. He told them he would come back. He never did. Gabrielle Chanel grew up behind the stone walls of the Aubazine orphanage, run by nuns of the Congregation of the Sacred Heart of Mary. She wore black and white, the only colors allowed. She learned to sew. She learned silence. She learned to need very little, because very little was what she had. She was there until she was 18. Let that settle. The woman who would one day define elegance for the entire 20th century spent her childhood wearing an orphan's uniform, stitching fabric in a convent, with no mother, no father, no family name worth mentioning, no money, no connections, no map forward. If the world was a game, she had been handed the worst possible starting position. And she decided the game itself needed to change. At 18, she left the orphanage and began working as a seamstress in the town of Moulins. She was quick with a needle, quicker with her mind, and possessed of a quality that is very difficult to teach, the ability to look at the world as it was and see, clearly, how it should be. She took work as a cafe singer, not because she had a remarkable voice, but because she had presence. She performed 2 songs repeatedly at the clubs and cabarets of Moulins and later Vichy, songs about a lost cat in Paris and a girl who couldn't find her lover's key. The audiences would call for encores by shouting the name of the first song. Coco, Coco. And a name was born. At the cabarets, she met Etienne Balsan, a wealthy textile heir with a stud farm near Paris, a man of privilege who existed in the gilded world of French aristocracy. He became her lover, her patron, her entry point into a universe entirely different from the one she had known. She moved onto his estate at Royalou. She observed. She studied. She watched the wealthy women around her, and she saw something that should have been obvious but somehow wasn't. The fashionable woman of 1905 was a monument to discomfort. She wore a corset so tightly laced it compressed her organs and made deep breathing physically impossible. She wore skirts so voluminous and heavy they made quick movement unthinkable. She wore hats so elaborate, stuffed with feathers, flowers, fruit, entire taxidermied birds, that they required pinning directly to her hair and could weigh several pounds. She wore layers upon layers of fabric, of ornament, of decoration, in colors chosen not for their beauty but for their expense. She was dressed not to move through the world, but to signal her status within it. She could not run, she could barely walk, she could not work. She was a very expensive, very elaborately decorated piece of furniture. Coco Chanel looked at this and felt something between fury and fascination. She borrowed Balson's polo shirts. She took his jerseys, fabric designed for men's sportswear, practical and soft, and she wore them. She cut her hair short when women simply did not cut their hair short. She moved freely. She breathed deeply. She looked, to everyone around her, utterly unlike what a woman was supposed to look like. And she looked, to an astonishing number of people, more elegant than anyone they had ever seen. She had stumbled upon, or rather, arrived at through pure instinct, one of the most radical ideas in the history of design. Elegance is not the addition of things. It is the removal of everything unnecessary. In 1910, with help from another lover, the wealthy English businessman Arthur Capel, the great love of her life, whom she called Boy, Coco Chanel opened a small millinery shop at 21 Rue Cambon in Paris. She had no formal training in design, no degree, no established name, no family connections in the industry. She was a woman in a world that barely acknowledged women as participants in commerce, let alone as visionaries. She made hats. Simple hats, unadorned hats. Hats that sat cleanly on the head without threatening to collapse under their own architectural ambition. Hats that a woman could wear and still turn her head, still laugh, still exist as a person rather than a pedestal. The actresses of Paris, always the early adopters of the new, noticed immediately. Orders came, then more orders, then a second shop in Deauville, the seaside resort where the wealthy French spent their summers, then a third in Biarritz. By the start of World War I, Chanel had a business, a real one, and the war, tragic and transforming in every dimension, accelerated everything she was doing. With men at the front, women entered the workforce in enormous numbers. They needed to move. They needed to work. The corset and the 7-pound hat were suddenly not just uncomfortable, they were absurd. Women began to want what Chanel had been making, clothing that allowed them to live. She designed jersey dresses, jersey, the fabric used for men's underwear, previously considered far too lowly for women's fashion. She created wide trousers. She made comfort revolutionary. And in 1921, she released a perfume. She told the perfumer Ernest Beau that she wanted something unprecedented, a scent that smelled like a woman, not like a flower, something complex, layered, abstract, something with no direct reference in nature. He brought her a series of numbered samples. She chose number 5. Chanel number 5 became the best-selling perfume in the history of the world. When Marilyn Monroe was asked, decades later, what she wore to bed, she answered, "Just a few drops of Chanel number 5. It remains in production today, more than a century later, still. What drove Chanel was not trend. It was not commerce, though she understood commerce brilliantly. It was not the desire to be fashionable. She had contempt for fashion's endless, anxious chasing of the new. It was a philosophy. Deeply felt, ferociously held, expressed not in manifestos, but in every single thing she made. The first principle, simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. Chanel believed, and proved repeatedly, that taking things away was harder and more powerful than adding them. Every button she removed, every layer she stripped, every unnecessary ornament she discarded was an act of courage, because the world always screams for more. More decoration, more complexity, more noise. She said, simplicity is the keynote of all true elegance. She also said, before you leave the house, look in the mirror and remove one accessory. This was not styling advice. It was a philosophy of life. The second principle, dress for freedom, not for approval. Chanel's entire creative mission was the liberation of the body. She wanted women to be able to breathe, move, run, think, work, love, fully inhabit their lives without their clothing working against them. She understood something that most designers of her era did not. A woman who is comfortable in what she is wearing becomes more beautiful. Confidence is its own elegance. A girl should be two things, classy and fabulous. But more importantly, the most courageous act is still to think for yourself, aloud. The third principle, innovation means looking where others refuse to look. The fabrics Chanel used, jersey, tweed, wool, were considered lowly materials, unsuitable for fashion. She took them and made them extraordinary, not by disguising what they were, but by insisting that their practical beauty was precisely their value. She borrowed from men's wardrobes, the blazer, the polo shirt, the wide trouser, and translated them for women, not as imitation but as liberation. Innovation, she understood, rarely comes from within the established world of a discipline. It comes from the edges, from the borrowings, from the person willing to look at what everyone has agreed to ignore and say, what if this is actually the answer? The fourth principle, elegance is an attitude, not a price tag. Chanel famously introduced costume jewelry at a time when real gems were the only acceptable adornment. She stacked ropes of fake pearls and called it chic. She insisted that the point was not authenticity of material, but intention of aesthetic. A woman who cuts her hair is about to change her life, she said, and she had lived it herself. The transformation was always internal first. The external simply followed. The fifth principle, reinvent on your own terms. In 1939, at the outbreak of World War II, Chanel closed her fashion house. She spent the war years in Paris, in complicated and morally contested circumstances. She lived at the Ritz, had a relationship with a German officer, and engaged in wartime activity that has been debated and criticized ever since. It remains the darkest chapter of her story, the part that her legacy has never fully resolved. After the war, she was ostracized, suspected of collaboration. Her reputation in France was shattered. She went to Switzerland. For 9 years, she lived in exile. And then, in 1954, at the age of 70, she came back. 70 years old, 9 years in exile, a reputation that many thought was finished. She reopened her fashion house. The French press was merciless. They said she was out of touch, irrelevant, a relic. Her first post-war collection was described by Paris critics as a fiasco and a disappointment. But the American press and American women saw something different. They saw the clothes. Clean, wearable, real Chanel. The collection was a triumph in the United States and Britain. Orders flooded in. The fashion world was forced to reckon with her again. And in 1955, she designed a small quilted leather handbag with a chain strap, the kind of strap that freed a woman's hands entirely. We know it today simply as the 2.55, named for February 1955. It is one of the most recognizable luxury objects in human history. It is still made, still coveted, still carried. She had come back from exile at 70 and created one of the most iconic objects of the 20th century. Coco Chanel died on January 10, 1971, a Sunday in her suite at the Ritz Hotel in Paris. She was 87 years old. She had been working until the end. Her next collection was already being prepared. A seamstress said of her final days, she was still pinning, still adjusting, still seeing what could be taken away. She never married. She had loved deeply Boy Capel, who died in a car accident in 1919, a loss from which she said she never fully recovered, others after him. But she built her life around her work, her vision, her singular sense of what the world could be. She was not perfect. She was difficult, sometimes ruthless, often contradictory. She lied about her age and her origins for most of her life. She preferred the story of herself to the facts of herself, which is perhaps understandable for a woman who had so much reason to want a different beginning. She was complicated in the way that all genuinely original people tend to be complicated. But what she made was clear, and lasting, and true. She is credited with liberating women from the corset. She introduced the concept of casual chic to the entire world. She made the color black, previously reserved for mourning, the color of universal elegance. She gave women trousers, jersey, comfort, and the freedom to move through their own lives. She is the only fashion designer named on Time magazine's list of the 100 most influential people of the 20th century. Her name, that two-syllable word she earned in a smoky cabaret, is, more than 50 years after her death, one of the most recognized words on earth. The orphan girl in black and white had dressed the world. Come back to yourself now. Come back to your life. Think about the weight you are carrying that isn't yours. The expectations you are meeting that were never your own. The complexity you have added, layer by layer, trying to be enough, trying to look like enough for a world that set the criteria before you had any say in the matter. Think about what you are wearing, metaphorically. What is corseting you? What is so heavy it is keeping you from moving? What have you added and added and added, looking for sufficiency and accumulation, when the answer might be the precise opposite? Coco Chanel grew up with nothing. No parents, no name worth keeping, no money, no connections, no permission from any authority to exist as she intended to exist. And so she simply, with extraordinary courage, extraordinary clarity, extraordinary patience, became herself. She looked at a world that had been designed by others, for others, and she said, "This is not beautiful enough to justify its cruelty. Let me show you something better." She stripped away the unnecessary. She chose simplicity when complexity was the only acceptable option. She wore what allowed her to move freely when freedom was not what women were supposed to want. She built a business from nothing, lost everything, returned from exile at 70, and made something timeless from the years she had left. She proved that elegance is not what you are given. It is what you choose, deliberately, in full knowledge of what you are leaving behind. And that is the invitation she extends to you, across all the years between her life and yours. What are you ready to remove? What rule, what expectation, what inherited idea about who you are supposed to be can you finally set down? What layer of complexity is costing you more than it is giving you? What simple, true, free version of yourself is waiting underneath everything you have piled on top of it? You do not need to be born into the right family. You do not need a prestigious beginning. You do not need permission. Chanel had none of these things. What she had was something far more powerful, the refusal to let the world's idea of her become her idea of herself. She said it once, in the simplest possible way. "I don't do fashion, I am fashion." She wasn't being arrogant. She was being free. She had stopped asking the world what she was allowed to be and started simply being it, fully, clearly, without apology. That is the most radical act available to any human being. Not rebellion, not loudness, not the aggressive performance of nonconformity. Just the quiet, daily, courageous decision to be genuinely, simply, elegantly yourself. The world is still waiting to see what you will make with that. Take off the corset, set down the weight, begin.